Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. Today I'm introducing chapter number 7 of this journey through the history of sports cards, where I am inducting the Michael Jordan rookie card into the binder of fame. And I'm also going to be talking about two separate stories, one being the story of underwhelming, and the other one is the Pete Rozelle SP card, or the commemorative card in 1989 Pro Set. But I want to start off by elevating the Michael Jordan rookie card into the binder of fame, because the thing about the Jordan rookie card is that it is one of 3, if not 4 cards that are universally definitive of sports cards across the for multiple generations. But more specifically, it's a card that stands out in one sport that's not baseball, which is unusual. Because when you think of a definitive football card, you're going to have a tough time thinking of one. For some people, it might be the Joe Montana rookie card. For some, it may be Joe Namath. It might be Dan Marino. There are a number of different cards that do kind of stand out. But hardly any card has a universal appeal in the world of football. Hockey is very similar, where there just aren't cards in hockey that are very distinct across the entire sport of hockey. Whereas in baseball, it's a lot more common because you have the Honus Wagner, which is its own amazing affair, which is, it rises even beyond all of baseball. So it is symbolic across America. And then you have the 1952 Topps, which is symbolic because it is presumably the greatest player of all time in the possibly the most iconic set for the history of baseball. So both of those cards stand out very distinctly for generations because they are the standard bearers of cards. But you could also throw the Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card from Upper Deck into that fold, because it was the current card, the modern card. Well, I shouldn't say current, definitely, but the modern card that was very symbolic. So it is borderline for a universal symbol of sports cards. But outside of that, basketball has a unique situation where they actually do have one card that is truly iconic, that can stand up through the course of time. The reason that it's so iconic, though, is because with basketball, there was so little that was done prior to 1986 Fleer. There were only 16 major card sets that had been created, dating all the way back to 1948-49. So when you figure from 1948 to 1986, there were only 16 sets. That really does give a good idea of just how difficult it is to have a symbolic card. Because, I mean, you look at somebody like Bill Russell or Bob Cousy. They had 2 cards. Then you have Wilt Chamberlain and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. You had that insane 1969 set, which was just loaded with rookie cards of prominent players. And some of those cards are quite iconic. But still, there's a separation from that to the 1986 set, where with the 86 set, it was accessible. We could all have a card from 1986, and it was recent too, so that meant that we could actually relate to this card. Because basketball and football and hockey, they're not built on legendary pasts. They have players from the past that we respect, but like in football, there are a lot of people who, as far as they're concerned, anything before the Super Bowl doesn't even count. In basketball, anything before Larry Bird and Magic Johnson is already suspect because the nature of the game was not very competitive. And then in hockey, okay, well, hockey I can't really speak to, so I'm just going to let that stand on its own. But the idea of the importance of history is always pretty difficult in these non-baseball sports, partially because baseball had been around for so long, and in part because the nature of how games change has been so dominant to how we've experienced the game. I mean, right now, basketball is nothing like it was in the 1980s and 1990s. There's almost no shred of the same sport. Football hasn't changed as much, but there are a lot of changes that have been going on as well. And so the nature of, it used to be that running backs got picked first in the draft from time to time. That doesn't even happen anymore. So the recent past is what really carries with most collectors. And so in basketball, there was this great revolution that happened, not in terms of the change of the game as much as how we saw the game, primarily through Michael Jordan. And so there's this one card that was accessible, It was recent, we could see the lineage, and it was a player we were very familiar with, and it checked every single box. But what was beautiful about it was the fact that we could all easily recognize the card. It didn't look like anything else, it wasn't exotic, and it was a frequent sight. I mean, the Jordan rookie card itself, there was a good chance we might see one, but there was almost a guarantee that you'd seen cards from that set. And so it filled everything that we needed for a budding young industry to emerge, which was the basketball corner of the hobby. For that industry to really grow up and evolve into what it needed to be, it was inventing its own presence, whereas baseball had had a long-standing tradition going back to the 1950s. And so the Michael Jordan card, it worked so well in giving that iconic stature to all collectors as we found our feet underneath us and across the hobby. The card worked really well as the symbol of basketball cards. And having a symbolic card, that one card that stands for your longing and the concept of card collecting today, it ties that across to the actual tradition of cards. That's really important. And that's something that, for instance, the Joe Namath rookie card does a pretty good job of fulfilling that role, where when you look at it, you go, okay, yeah, that card is an unusual card from an unusual time, and we're probably going to remember that the AFL was related to that card, and there are going to be enough pieces for us to feel the nature of that time and the distinction of that time. But it's separated away in time, but that's okay, because the NFL was that way. For basketball, everything was brand new. And it was almost like for card collecting in basketball, anything before 1986 didn't really exist, didn't really matter. And if you went back to it, it was like uncovering a treasure chest in some long-lost cave. It had that kind of a feel to it, which, in large part because we didn't even really recognize basketball in the 1970s. So going back to the 1970s, it was fascinating to see this other thing that was separated away from us. And there are cards in there that were iconic in their own way, but it really did have a distinct quality all its own. So the Michael Jordan rookie card, I want to talk a little bit more in depth into the nature of why this card was so significant, but I'm putting this in as the third card into the Binder of Fame. Not that that really matters so much as this is joining the Honus Wagner and the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle card. It is becoming the third card with those, where all three of these cards are truly iconic of their sport, of the traditions of their hobby. And I really can't think of any card that could even be considered to go into the Binder of Fame before the Michael Jordan rookie card. So this is what I'm putting in and what I'm elevating to the Binder of Fame this month. But I did also want to tell two stories about cardboard, the first being about Manon Rhéaume. And in the case of Manon Rhéaume, she is both a mover and shaker and an interesting blip in the history of sports cards. This is one of those cases where if you were collecting cards in 1992 and 1993, it's a guarantee you knew her name. Now, in hockey, there are a couple of names everybody knew. Everybody knew the name Wayne Gretzky. Everyone knew Mario Lemieux. Everyone knew Patrick Waugh. Probably knew Steve Yzerman. Good chance you were going to know Jaromir Jagr or Pavel Bure. There were a number of Theo Fleury. There were a number of names that really did kind of transcend hockey. But that was because of how much conversation was going on at the time. But you really didn't know a lot of names past that. So you may hear a name like Martin Brodeur or Marc Messier, and it could kind of register in your mind of, oh, I've heard that name. Because with hockey, that's just kind of, unless you were in the world of hockey, outside of it, it was a sport that did not port out well, whereas basketball really did. And so as the 90s were really building up, hockey was always that other sport. It had finally been surpassed by basketball. It had finally become a major conversation in the country. And in fact, the future stars world of sports cards, which was built around college players who were about to turn pro, that was really built on the back of basketball. And then football was the other foundation of it. Hockey and baseball were just kind of afterthoughts when it came to this, because they have minor leagues, and that's really where you're likely to see players come up. But as much as hockey was that void in our consciousness for most of us in card collecting, every once in a while something would pop through that would catch our attention, and nothing hit more than the name Manon Rhéaume. And that was because she was the first woman who was ever able to compete in a men's league. And I'm not talking like making it into the minors. She suited up for the Tampa Bay Lightning, an NHL team, for an exhibition game, a preseason game, trying to make the roster. She did not make the roster, but she actually did compete on the ice with players like Brett Hull. I mean, it was impressive what she was able to get to do. And I say get to do because the team did in fact hire her as a publicity stunt. The Tampa Bay Lightning had just been formed as an expansion team. Tampa was not a city that understood hockey or really cared. And so they needed to do something to really, really excite fans. And so they signed her on to try to make the squad. And she very wisely didn't take offense at it. She looked and went, wow, I have a chance. And by doing that, that turned her into a household name. And it led to her having a pretty good minor league career in the years that followed. So Manon Rhéaume, she did a wonderful job of taking advantage of a great chance. And she didn't have so much a magnificent pedigree that was built up over time where people were watching. She came essentially out of nowhere. That doesn't mean that she was a joke or that she was somebody to not really take seriously. She was somebody who had not put together a big enough resume for people for it to make sense why she was on the team. But look, she was given a chance, she took advantage of it, and she showed she was not scared, she was not going to back down, she was going to put everything she had into it, which is what you need to see. And so she very clearly earned an opportunity to play minor league hockey. But she was the first, and usually you think of the first as the gateway to everybody else. Once you've got a foot in the door, everybody's going to come in. But that's presuming that there is a natural place for athletes or for people to move into. And that's the thing, is that she had not worked her way up to earn a spot in the sport the way that most female NASCAR drivers had already done, working their way up through the sport to earn their place in that sport. And so prior to 1992, the only time that we saw women on sports cards was either Olympics cards or Sports Illustrated kids cards. And in those two spaces, we really did see a fair number of women showing up because of the nature of the sport. In the case of Sports Illustrated Kids, it showed you LPGA, it showed you women's tennis, it showed you a wide range of sports that covered all bases. Whereas with the Olympics, look, close to half of the Olympics is women's sports anyway, so of course you're going to have female athletes show up in an Olympic set. But outside of that, it was all men's sports. I mean, prior to the WNBA, name another women's league. There were a couple of professional leagues, but they were hardly even noticed. And so there was no reason to make cards for women in sports. And so in 1992, when Classic made the first Manon Rhéaume card, this was the first time that a female athlete showed up on a card that was not Olympics nor a Sports Illustrated kids set. There were a few women who had appeared on cards. There was the announcer card with Moran in Skybox 1990. There were the Pro Line wives cards, so those were out there. But we're talking about an actual athlete. Manon was the first one. There would be almost no other women who would actually compete in men's leagues across the board. I mean, I think we've seen a few women at this point play the kicking position in college football, but none of them have really shown. So there's that. We did have I think it's only 3 women at this point who have either been drafted by or signed with NBA teams, but no women have ever competed in a preseason game for men's basketball. So it's not like the door opened up and all of a sudden there was this flood of athletes. It was basically Manon, and I think Erin Witten is the other female hockey player who has actually played in the men's league. But by opening that door, it got people interested. And so all of a sudden in 1993, you had cards of Cami Granado, and then the U.S. women's hockey team got a whole card set. And so there was this interest of who's going to be next. And I find the Cami Granado one kind of interesting because Manon was a goalie. And goalie is the kind of position that you're going to, it's like kicker in football. It's all about precision, it's all about reaction, it's all about smarts. It's not that physical of a position, so you don't have to worry so much about the male frame versus the female frame. Cami, on the other hand, she was a center. So that means she's out there battling it on the ice. And so it's interesting to see the interest that people were paying, because if you're going to go with somebody else, look, Cami was a great hockey player, but the only thing she really had going for herself in terms of being a symbol is the fact that her brother, Tony Granado, was a very successful hockey player. So there was name recognition, and she was really good. But there wasn't a lot of interest in figuring out who is going to be the next female hockey player who's going to be potentially competing in the NHL. Mainly, I think, because everybody knew that the Manon Rhéaume story was a fluke. But a fluke it may have been, but she did, like I said, hold up a pretty good minor league career. And so she ended up appearing on a lot of cards in the mid-1990s, early to mid-90s, on these Future Stars sets, mostly with Classic, but also Collector's Edge included her in their ice set. And so she did get a fair number of cards because she was holding in there, and she was that one name that was not at the top of the sport that everybody kind of knew. And so it created an enthusiasm around not as much hockey as much as these Future Stars sets, these college players and minor leaguers that you were seeing in this whole other space of sports cards that really didn't have anything carrying it. Because you'd have a draft, a bunch of stars, and then that's over. And Classic did like to make cards of Shaq for quite a few years and keep that momentum going. Well, Manon filled that same role, where she was able to provide the company with quite a few years of a lot of interesting cards that people recognized and wanted to pursue. So she was kind of a shining light of a whole corner of the hobby that was not hockey, because she actually never had a major NHL card set feature her, including Upper Deck. And in 1992, you would think that if any card company would be putting in a prospect who actually was competing to make it onto an NHL squad, you'd think Upper Deck would do it. They put everybody in, but Manon never made it into those sets. She was only in the space that we refer to as future, or that Beckett refers to as Future Stars. She was only in that area. But she had a lot of cards there because, again, there was a very light but a very solid reverberation through that corner of the hobby. And again, she is one of the few hockey names that we actually recognized and could pretty well pay attention to. So I want to talk a little bit more in depth into that in a separate video. But I wanted to do this as the preliminary story looking into it. And the second story of cardboard I want to talk about is the Pete Rozelle commemorative card in 1999 by Pro Set. And this is not a groundbreaking card as much as it is the beginning of a whole trend in sports cards, which is the SP card, as well as the chase card. Now, this card was not the first true chase card, because chase cards by nature are the cards you're hunting for. So let's say that you have a 1987 Topps card set. And what card do you want to get out of it? Well, you're probably going to be trying to get the Bo Jackson rookie card. That's probably going to be your whole focus. So you're going to plunge into that set, and you're going to be hunting around finding the Bo Jackson card. Basically, it's the same rarity as everything else. It's not going to appear any more common or any more rare than anything else, but that's the card you want to get. And so for a lot of people, they're going to keep opening packs until they get to that card that they want. And that's the whole point of a chase card, is that's the carrot. You're opening packs trying to get it. But most chase cards, like I said, were either as common as all the other cards in the set. It's just the one card that you're trying to hunt down, which the best example of that is the 1990 Score Bo Jackson football baseball card, or it's a card that is very unusual and you're hoping to come across it, which in the late 80s was usually error cards. And to this day, people still like to open up packs of like 1989 Fleer, hoping to get one of those super rare Billy Ripken cards, even though you're not going to be getting it. But setting that aside, that's what the chase card, the real energy behind chase cards was the rare card, the one that's more difficult to get than the regular card set, which card companies liked because that meant that you weren't just opening packs to complete a set, you'd still be buying packs afterwards trying to get more cards. And so in 1989, when Pro Set was launched, they decided to create a special card, which they called an SP card, for Pete Rozelle. This is very simple because, well, the NFL had approached Lud Denny to make a card set. And so Pro Set was created as the speaker in a way for the NFL. And so honoring the outgoing Pete Rozelle was a good move, but also it was Pete Rozelle's administration that had brought Lud Denny in. And so we're transitioning over to Paul Tagliabue, which nothing wrong with that. But why not give a farewell to the friend who brought you in the first place? And this wasn't the only case in 1989 for this to happen, because over in Score, they finished their set out with a Tom Landry Thanks for the Memories card. Pro Set kind of did the same thing with Pete Rozelle, but in the case of Landry, that's just another card in the set, no different than any other card, whereas the Pete Rozelle card was an SP card, which meant that it was more rare. It was going to be less common to come across the card, and because it was a separate card that did not fit into the numeric sequence, that meant that it felt special, it seemed special, and that was that thing that people wanted to open extra packs hoping to get that card. And SP cards would have a pretty good history with sports cards early in the 90s, because at this time, there were basically no chase cards that were inserts. In most cases in 1990, 91, 92, the insert cards that you were going to be finding were usually one per pack. Whether that was the 1,000-Yard Club cards or Team Leader cards, whether it was the Pro Set Super Bowl cards, these cards were so frequent in packs that they were just another thing that you were trying to put together as you were moving along. Nothing seemed rare and exciting about, well, exciting somewhat, but nothing seemed all that rare. And so that was the thing about an SP card, was that it seemed like a very unique special card that you weren't going to run into very often. And so people started to chase after these cards. Well, card companies are going to figure this out. So in 1990, you had SP cards like the Pro Set Lombardi hologram, and then you also had the Reggie Jackson autograph, a few cards like that. 1991, you got a little bit further out where Pro Line had a couple in there, and Pro Set started to do NBA Hoops started to do in 1992, and Upper Deck in 1991 started doing SP cards like a set where every release had a unique SP card. And so we were starting to see these one-off cards appear because they really did carry in a special way. Even if a card company like with Upper Deck had an insert set, the SP cards still stood beyond that and felt more rare than the inserts, which they might have been more rare, they might not have been more rare, but it still felt special. And so this was a bridge that we went through until we figured out the new type of chase card, which came from inserts for the most part, but you also got into that with parallels. So as you were getting into 1993, the SP card no longer had a significant role because the role that it played was very specific. Now, when you talk about special SP cards or the beginning of SP cards, you're going to be talking about the hologram from Pro Set. You're going to be talking about the Reggie Jackson autograph. You're not going to be talking about the Pete Rozelle card because it's not a card that's really remembered. Instead, it's one of those things where even today you look and you go, oh, cool, I didn't know they made that. But if you were to ask the average person what the first SP card was and you say it was from 1989 Pro Set, you're probably going to hear the Santa Claus card, which is wrong because that was never in packs. Very few people know about the Pete Rozelle card. And it's not like this was the first time there was a commissioner card, because, well, baseball used to do that in the 1960s. But in the NFL, it'd been quite a while since we'd had a commissioner card, simply because the last time we'd had a commissioner card, he was one of the coaches, and so that's why he had a card. But it was a commemorative card. That was the whole point. And so I don't discuss it here to say this reshaped card collecting. Far from it. It didn't do that at all. Instead, what it did was it began a new chapter. And I wanted to highlight that this card was out there. It was the beginning of this journey of at least SP cards. But again, that led into the special chase cards that we got with rare insert sets and rare parallels. Those emerged out of the same concept that this had of a card in a pack that's more rare than anything else, which at that time pretty much only Fleer was doing. I think Don Russ was doing their BC cards at this point, but Fleer was the main company that was doing this. And even with them, it wasn't really that significant in the hobby. It would take the Pro Set hologram, it would take the Reggie Jackson autograph, and the 91 Don Russ Elite cards to really build that new chapter. But it came off of the back of this, which established that whole idea of a rare card in packs that is separate from the card set. So I'm going to be doing individual videos talking a little bit more in depth into these different topics. So I do urge you to take the opportunity to look for those videos, and do subscribe if you haven't done so already, because I've got a whole collection of videos that I've done over time, and I'm going to continue to add cards to the stories here in this Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame and Elevating Cards. And so I'm going through the history piece by piece. That's what I'm doing here with this channel. So definitely subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you very much for watching.